Why hello there, and welcome back to Let's Make Us a Character. As you may recall, 2024 marked the 50th anniversary of Dungeons & Dragons, widely regarded as the first modern role-playing game. And also the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is why I made a silly little game that combined the two. But for just as long as there has been Dungeons & Dragons, so too have there been people saying, yeah, actually that's kinda shit, let's do that, but better. Which is why in 1975 we got Tunnels and Trolls, a game that is very upfront about being Dungeons & Dragons, but better, as clearly stated in the introduction. When Frank Denton, noted raconteur, collector, musicologist, world traveler, and fan publisher, first mentioned Dungeons & Dragons in one of his publications, he lit a fire of curiosity within me that was not satisfied until 2 months later when Mark Anthony guided me into the presence of a person, nameless now and forevermore, who possessed the rules of the game. After several hours of examination of those rules, I reached the following two conclusions. 1. $10 was too much to pay for 3 little booklets of rules, and 2. The game could be simplified and changed in concept to retain the best parts of the original idea, with better ideas substituted for the things I didn't like about D&D. And as it is currently 2025, you may have already figured out that that means this year is the 50th anniversary of Tunnels and Trolls. Yeah, we're gonna start getting a lot of role-playing game 50th anniversaries in the coming years. So I figured, why not take a look at what is widely regarded to be the second modern role-playing game, but is arguably actually the first, because making bold statements like that is how you get clicks and engagement. But before I get into all that, I do need to talk about additions. Like any good classic role-playing game, Tunnels and Trolls has an odd and confusing version history, having somewhere between 5 and 13 editions. But because this is not Dungeons & Dragons, the early editions have not been as obsessively archived and distributed, and as such, I only have access to the first edition from 1975, or more specifically the 2013 reprint, and the 4th edition rules from 1977. And as you may have assumed from that time frame, they are very similar. Not just the same rules, but the same text with some additions and revisions. So I am going to be going off of the 4th edition rules here, but will also be pointing out when there's a notable difference between that and 1st. So now, let's make us a Tunnels and Trolls character. Characters in Tunnels and Trolls are very simple. So simple in fact that it is recommended to write down your character on a 3x5 card. Characters have 6 prime attributes: strength, intelligence, luck, constitution, dexterity, and charisma, and we roll 3d6 for each, giving a range of 3 to 18. Or rather, 1 to 36 if we take into account the modifiers for man-like characters, which do have some fun options, but are otherwise some of the worst modifiers I have ever seen. Dwarves double their strength and constitution. Elves increase intelligence, luck, and dexterity by half, and double charisma. Leprechauns just have strength and constitution. Fairies get 1/4 strength and constitution, 1 1/2 times dexterity, and double luck and charisma. And hobbits, half strength, 1 1/2 times dexterity, and double constitution. And there are no additional benefits or restrictions aside from fairies being too solid and heavy to fly if their strength is above 2, So presumably having the ability to fly if their strength is 2 or lower. And while fairies and hobbits have pros and cons, dwarves and elves are just objectively better, they only get bonuses, and leprechauns objectively worse, they only have penalties. But just for the purpose of example, let's make an elf, giving us adjusted totals of Strength 15, Intelligence 24, Luck 13, Constitution 8, Dexterity 13, and Charisma 28. We get a bonus to attacks equal to 1 for every point above 12 in Strength, Luck, and Dexterity, so plus 5, with the Dexterity bonus being doubled on missile attacks, so plus 6. And if any of those scores were under 9, it would be minus 1 per point under 9. And these are very unfortunately called adds and subtracts. We begin speaking the common tongue and get 1 additional high tongue per point of intelligence above 12, so 12 additional languages. Luck is also used for saving throws, which will be covered later. Constitution is our hit points, so 8. And Charisma affects a whole bunch of things, but for right now, with Charisma of 28, we are a leader of men who people will willingly die for, and or more beautiful than the world. And notably, that is for a score of 21 or higher, and elves and fairies double charisma, so are just that charismatic on average. We can also befriend beings with charisma 5 points lower than ours, and command beings with charisma 10 points or more lower. Then, just because they're here, we might as well use the optional rules for rolling height and weight, so 6'1" and 170 pounds. And we could subtract 2 inches and 10 pounds for a female character, or we could not, which is actually the recommended method. And then as an elf, our height and weight are modified by, dead serious here, 5/4 and 3/5. Also notably, there are no height and weight adjustments for leprechauns. I mean, it's not really going to be an issue because why would you ever play as a leprechaun who have 2 of their most important attributes halved with no corresponding bonuses, but if you did want to, you would not have those adjustments. And we have a final adjusted height and weight of 7'7" and a quarter and 102 pounds. This game has an interesting interpretation of elves. And next up we have character type, which is basically class, and we have 3 options here: warrior, magic user, and rogue. The difference being that warriors cannot use magic users cannot use warrior weapons, and rogues can use all magic and weapons, but do not start with any spells, must be taught all of their spells by a magic user, and cannot advance beyond level 7. In 1st edition. In 4th, they can continue advancing as a wizard warrior, the only restriction being maintaining a strength score higher than intelligence. So, depending on how generous your GM is with opportunity and cost to learn spells, rogue/wizard warrior may be the objectively best class since they get access to all of the warrior weapons and magic user spells. Like, warriors do get a little something extra that I will explain later, but for the most part, rogues seem to be the best of both worlds. However, the book does recommend being a warrior if your strength is higher than intelligence and luck, magic user if your intelligence is the highest, and rogue if your luck is the highest. And our intelligence is just ever so slightly higher, so let's go with magic user. Then onto equipment, we get 3d6 times 10, so 100 gold. And where do we buy our equipment, you ask? Well, near the entrance to every tunnel are great supermarkets for dungeon delvers. Is that the most realistic and historically/mythologically accurate option they could have gone with? No, of course not. It is, however, the one that makes things easiest for the game, and is a little detail that I really like, and I think shows that they were keeping in mind that this is a game, and that any part of the game that is boring isn't necessary. So you can focus on fighting trolls and finding treasure, rather than the 2-day trek back to the nearest village to buy cheese and torches. However, this is also where things are going to get a little tricky. As mentioned, magic users do not get access to warrior weapons, being restricted to daggers, torches, and other 1-die weapons, and do not get their adds from strength, luck, and dexterity. It is even specifically stated that the 1d6 plus 5 sax is the most powerful weapon that a magic user can wield. In 1st edition, while those rules are unchanged in 4th, it is also added that magic users can get their adds when fighting unarmed or wielding a quarterstaff. So our two most damaging options here are going to be 1d6 plus 5 with a sax, or 2d6 plus 5 with a quarterstaff, so obviously we're going to go with that one. However, it doesn't say what, if any, kind of armor magic users can wear, but let's just go with a steel cap for reasons. Then of course pick up some adventuring essentials, and you might be thinking that this is a pretty small collection of equipment, and that the culprit is once again our old enemy carrying capacity. And you're kinda right. Our weight possible, carrying capacity, is equal to strength times 100, so 1500. And like D&D, that is in coin weight. But all of our equipment only weighs 351 coins. And some of you know exactly why this character is so underburdened, and the rest will learn soon enough. As mentioned, a quarterstaff has 2 dice and no adds, so 2d6 plus 0, dexterity needed of 15, although it is specifically stated elsewhere that magic users can wield a quarterstaff with dexterity above 12, a dexterity penalty of -1 when wielding or carrying while fighting with another weapon, and strength needed of 10. And also weighs 10 pounds. If there is one universal element in fantasy role-playing games, it is severely overestimating the weight of everything. And armor is where things get a little bit wonky. In 1st edition, armor was added to Constitution and basically just gave you extra hit points, with it being specified that when taking damage, you get to choose whether it comes off of your armor or Constitution. But in 4th edition, armor is instead specified to reduce incoming damage, like you might expect armor to, with warriors having the option to burn their armor to multiply the damage absorbed against a single attack by their level at the cost of destroying the armor or shield. Although very notably, even in 4th edition, the basic armor table still reads, adds to Constitution. So our steel cap with armor 1 will reduce all incoming damage by 1 point. Then we get our starting spells, which is just every 1st level spell. And to cast said 1st level spells, we need to have an intelligence score of 10 and dexterity of 8, which then increases by 2 and 1 respectively for each spell level over 1. And this character is done. So now, let's talk about magic. Rather than the Vancian magic of D&D, which everyone just absolutely loves, Tunnels and Trolls actually uses a magic point type system. It's just that the magic points in question happen to be your strength. So if we wanted to cast the spell Hidey Hole, we would need to expend 10 points of strength to do so, and would also gain 20 experience points. Basically, you get double whatever strength points you expend to cast spells in experience. However, we can reduce the cost of casting all spells by our current level to a minimum of 1 by using a magic staff, which unfortunately cost 100 gold for an ordinary staff and 500 for a deluxe staff. However, we can also enchant a makeshift staff by expending 1 strength, which has the same properties as an ordinary staff, but will burn out after having a number of strength points spent through it equal to twice our intelligence, so 48. And now you presumably realize why I bought so little equipment, as our carrying capacity has just been reduced from 1500 to 400, with those strength points being regained at the rate of 1 per turn, which is an excellent segue into discussing the general structure of this game. Despite some very radical differences, this game is still heavily inspired by D&D conceptually, so it is assumed that gameplay will involve going down into a dungeon, fighting monsters, collecting treasure, and coming back up to the surface, then doing it all over again, delving deeper and deeper with each attempt for greater rewards at the cost of greater risks. But unlike Dungeons & Dragons, which had the same concept bolted onto a modified set of wargame rules, in Tunnels & Trolls the entire game is built around that very specific gameplay loop. So let's descend down into the tunnels and say that Faerith is adventuring on the first level of the dungeon with Grimbar the Dwarven Warrior, Splink the Fairy Rogue, and Steve the Human Warrior. Exploration is broken into 10-minute turns as a way to track progress, so when Heidi Hole says 3 turns, that means 30 minutes. And when I said spent strength returns at 1 per turn, that's 1 per 10 minutes. And if you're thinking that it's absurd to track the entire game in 10-minute increments, it's not really that much different than tracking time in 60-minute increments. If you decide to rest for an hour, that's just 6 turns and you regain 6 points of spent strength. You don't have to literally check in every 10 minutes. And another interesting note here is that it is specified that the party's actions for each turn are to be relayed through one player known as the Voicer or Group Leader, which is just very interesting as an example of how designers tried to make this sort of gaming arrangement work this early in the development of role-playing games. And of course, since our character has charisma of 28, the Voicer will be us. Also, I'm the only actual person here, so it would be hard if the Voicer was someone else. So, after discussing the course of action with the other players, we simply tell the DM that we are proceeding cautiously down the long dungeon corridor, and the DM replies that after following the stone passageway for 1 turn, the floor makes a clicking sound and everyone needs to make a saving roll, which is done by rolling 2d6 versus a target equal to a base value set by the dungeon level minus the character's luck score with a minimum of 5. And 3 saves and 1 fail, so Grimbar takes, let's say, 1 die damage, reduced by armor for 2 total damage. Then everyone who saved receives a number of experience points equal to their roll times the dungeon level, and if failed, experience points equal to the roll times damage taken. And you might be noticing the very real possibility of ending up with a target over 12, which tends to be a little difficult to roll on 2d6. Well, fortunately, if you roll doubles, you get to roll again and add that to the result, so rolling above 12 is not just possible, but plausible. But now, let's say that all that commotion has attracted the attention of a group of monsters. A couple trolls, of course, and a few goblins for flavor. When hostilities occur, the game is broken into combat turns, which are 1/5 of a regular turn. And here is where things start to get really interesting, especially when comparing this game to Dungeons & Dragons and other games that are just, basically Dungeons & Dragons. Monsters are defined by a single monster rating. They can be defined more thoroughly if desired, But that is the only statistic required by the mechanics. And after discussing our course of action amongst the players, it is decided that Faerith will cast Take That, You Fiend on the troll, Splink will fire an arrow at the closest goblin, and Grimbar and Steve will get into position and prepare for the coming attack. So Grimbar and Steve get into position, Splink fires the arrow, and with a dexterity of 21, needs to roll a 1 through 4 to hit, and does. And then things get complicated again. Those range attack rules I just used were not in 1st edition. Rather, the monster would roll its monster dice against the combined total of the attacker's luck and dexterity, and if failed, the attacker would then roll their weapon dice against the monster's roll, dealing damage to the amount, if any, by which the attack roll surpassed the defense. But 4th edition does not provide such damage adjustment rules, and even states, how much damage a missile attack does depends on a whole bunch of other factors. But you all know how to compute that, so I'm not going to go into it here. Toodles! So I must assume that ranged attacks just deal the full amount of damage that a melee attack does. So for damage, a bow usually does 2 dice, so I'm going to assume a tiny bow only does 1 die, -7 from Splink's strength of 2, +12 from luck of 24, and +18 from dexterity of 21. Remember, the dexterity bonus is doubled on missile attacks. So 27 damage overall, which is subtracted from the goblin's monster rating. And since I'm sure you're wondering, as a character being attacked by a monster, you would just make a saving roll to avoid a missile attack. But once again, while that is still mentioned in the 4th edition saving roll rules, the ones specifying that you would then subtract your luck from the damage have also been removed. So, like the armor rules, this is something of an issue with revisions of very old games. There was a lot of slapping new rules onto existing ones, sometimes cutting out the ones they replaced, sometimes not, rather than just writing an entire set of revised rules. Like, it is possible that removing the damage reduction rules from range attacks was intentional. Or it's possible that they were just overlooked because to the designer they were such an obvious part of the mechanics that it wasn't even noticed that they were missing. Because as you have and will continue to see, ranged attacks based on these rules as written can be a little overpowered. But moving on, we cast our spell, which has no specified range, so I'm just going to assume we can cast it from here, and just deals damage equal to our intelligence score, and costs 6 strength, -1 from our staff, so 5 overall, and 24 damage. With that 5 points also being deducted from the total casting potential of our makeshift staff, and also gain double that in experience points. And while that is going on, the monsters were of course moving in on our position. So now, round 2, Splink and Faerith fall back, Splink attacking the next goblin and Faerith casting at the second troll, while Grimbar and Steve engage the enemy. And important to note here, the ability to fall back like this isn't in the rules. It is a call that I have made for reasons that will be evident shortly. Once again, Splink's attack hits for 28 damage and our spell for 24. Then melee commences. Grimbar is wielding a Great Axe, which deals 4 dice plus 3, plus 20 from strength, -1 from luck, and -2 from dexterity for 41 overall, which is not as amazing as you might be expecting it to be. And Steve is wielding a Gladius, which deals 2 dice plus nothing, +1 from strength and -1 from dex. But because the result was doubles, Steve has the option of berserking, trading adds and subtracts for another roll at the cost of -2 points of strength per turn. And since his overall adds are 0, sure, why not? So roll again, and 10. another set of doubles, so roll again, and 5, for a total of 23. And if your weapon only has 1 die, this will trigger on a result of 6, and if more than 2 dice, triggers on any result of doubles, but only gets 2 additional dice. So Grimbar had the option to Berserk 2, but would have been giving up a plus 20 for the potential of 2 exploding dice. Then the weird part, we add the melee attack rolls together for 64 overall. Then the monsters roll all of their dice, which are based on their monster rating, and add half their monster rating to that, for a total of 92. Then we compare the two totals, and obviously the monsters rolled higher, so we subtract the character total from the monster total for 28 damage, which is then divided between all of the characters involved in the melee, so 14 each to Grimbar and Steve, reduced to 11 and 9 respectively from their armor. And this is why I made that call on falling back. A level 1 fairy has constitution ranging from 1 to 4, so if there was no way for a character to exclude themselves from melee combat, most level 1 fairies would basically be one-hit characters, since you don't really have the same ability to mitigate risk as you would in more complex combat simulators. And the rules do say that magic users are not supposed to fight in ordinary combats, at least not physically. And not contributing to that total damage comparison, as well as requiring that other characters take greater risk, seems like a fair trade-off. So maybe that was the intention? So round 3, and this time Splink targets the first troll, since it is the bigger threat. And Faerith switches tactics and decides to cast Oh Go Away on the second, while Grimbar and Steve continue holding the line. So 25 damage to Troll 1, then to determine the effectiveness of Oh Go Away, we sum our intelligence, luck, and charisma, and since that is higher than the troll's monster rating, it does. And as we have also now reduced ourselves to an amount of strength which is less than that required to carry our equipment, we are presumably out of the fight until we can regain enough to stand up. Then for the melee, Grimbar rolls 14 plus 20, and Steve rolls 10, but because he is berserking, the second lowest dice is reduced to match the lowest dice, so 8. And since those are now a match, he gets to add 2 more dice for 18 total. So 52 overall for the character side. And 38 for the monsters, as after the first round they only add 1/4 their monster rating instead of half, so this time we win the melee and deal 14 damage, which is then divided between the 4 monsters, and I'll just be generous here and say 3 to Goblin 1 and 2, who are both dead now, and 4 to Goblin 3 and the remaining troll. So on to round 4, and I think that we can actually reason with this troll, and since Faerith speaks Trollish, she tells it that if it surrenders and agrees to work with us, we'll spare its life. And since the troll's monster rating has been reduced below 10, and let's be honest here, our charisma is 28, it agrees and stands down. Then everyone else just gangs up on the last goblin, and since that's 9 dice plus 43 versus 3 plus 6, even without the troll's help, there's really no point in rolling. So the goblin is dead, and the troll is now our, well, not exactly friend, but will do what we say for now out of fear for its gruesome life. Although it will also likely try to revolt against our control once it regains its strength. However, to do so, it must beat our charisma on a roll of 2d6, getting a second roll only on 2 6s, so it is possible, just very unlikely, which will give him plenty of time to learn about the power of friendship. And for defeating the monsters, we get experience points equal to the dungeon level divided by character level, so 1, times the total monster rating, including the troll who surrendered, but not the one who went away. So 150 points, presumably each. It never says to divide that amount after calculating, and just says that any character who actually participated in the combat gets experience for it. And since the calculation is based on individual character level, I have to assume that it is per character. And then let's say that they left behind 100 gold, so 25 each. And that is it for combat, and as a game from 1975, there aren't really any other mechanics beyond the saves and combat. Although the save rules should be easy enough to adapt into an attribute check system just by changing which attribute is subtracted from the base value. So as I said, it is not a game that allows for that specific experience, it is one that is built around it. Which isn't to say that it's limited to that one experience. While dungeon level is explicitly baked into the rules, that needn't necessarily refer to the literal depth you are going down to in a dungeon. It can be how far you are delving into the enchanted forest, or sneaking into enemy territory, or even just like a chapter number. Just any number that represents the difficulty of the current part of the game. Anyway, now that we are out of combat turns, we will rest for 3 turns, during which Fayrith and Steve will regain 3 points of strength, and the troll 15 monster rating, regaining enough strength to move, and since Steve is kinda on the verge of death here, it's probably a good idea to head back up for now. And upon returning to the surface alive, we receive experience points equal to 100 times the deepest level reached, so 100. Plus 1 for each gold worth of treasure we brought up with us, so another 25, and it is specified that XP for treasure does not apply until you leave the dungeon, whereas that for saves, defeating monsters, and spells is applied immediately. Also, just because I'm getting pretty good at predicting the dumb questions I'm going to get in the comments, you cannot just enter and exit the dungeon 20 times, collecting 100 XP each time you get back to the surface, because this isn't a video game, and the DM will just say, no. XP is also awarded for magic items found in the dungeon, and incidentally, it seems we have found a totally inconspicuous magical doodad, which is worth, I don't know, let's just say 666 experience points. And wow, look at that, 1,000 experience points. Just enough to level up. How convenient. And when we level up, we are given the option of adding our new level number to our strength, constitution, or charisma, twice that number to luck, half to intelligence or dexterity, or half each to strength and constitution, with it being specified that the constitution and strength bonuses can only be selected when returning to the surface, while the rest can be chosen while in a dungeon. A thing that may or may not be an issue depending on whether or not you are allowed to put off leveling up until reaching the surface, because strength and constitution, especially constitution, are kind of important. And also just because I am a very firm believer in you cannot level up in the dungeon, I must point out that it is specifically stated here that you can. So let's go with half in strength and constitution, increasing them both by 1, because, you know, we need the strength for spells and the con for not dying from a single attack. However, we don't actually get any new spells. Instead, we need to buy every new spell after first level, with level 2 spells costing 500 gold to learn each, and requiring intelligence of 12 and dexterity of 9 to cast. And as you may have assumed based on the fact that we can learn level 2 spells at level 2, there are in fact 18 levels of spells provided, although levels 10 through 13 only have 2 spells each, and 14 through 18 only 1. And let's just say that we were conveniently able to sell that inconspicuous doodad to an unassuming fellow for 500 gold and are able to learn Poor Baby, which provides magical healing at the cost of 2 points of strength per 1 point of constitution healed. And speaking of points, as a level 2 magic user, a magic staff now reduces the cost of all spells by 2, and also reduce the cost of casting lower level spells by the difference between our current level and the spell level. So now, casting Take That, You Fiend will only cost 3 points, the initial 6, minus 1 from the level difference, and 2 from the staff, and then at level 3, that will go down to just 1 point. Whereas when casting Poor Baby, we will only get that 2-point reduction from the staff, meaning that we can heal 2 points of Constitution for 2 points of Strength, but then each point of Constitution healed beyond that will cost 2 more points of Strength per casting. And while the cost of lower level spells does go down as you progress, the cost to learn and cast higher level spells gets considerably higher, with the cost to learn spells increasing by 500 gold for every level after second, and higher level spells costing dozens to hundreds of points of strength to cast, meaning that as a magic user, you really need to focus on pumping up your strength to ridiculous levels in order to be an effective magic user. Whereas a warrior would actually be better off focusing on luck, since it is the same bonus to attacks as strength, but also applies to saves, and when you level up, you can get double the new level to luck versus 1 time to strength or half to dexterity. And that was a Tunnels and Trolls character. 1st through 4th edition, which were mostly the same. Honestly, Edition just wasn't as meaningful of a classification back then, and often just meant new printing with minor fixes, hence the 4 editions in 3 years. Versus today, where edition wars are such a core part of D&D culture, that Wizards of the Coast rightly feared that calling their new edition a new edition would just splinter the 5e fanbase. And as a thing, Tunnels and Trolls is kinda weird. It is a game that literally exists because someone heard about D&D and thought it was a cool idea, but then found out that the actual game's rules didn't really serve that idea, and made one that did. And from a modern perspective, it is very interesting to see just how early the divide between war games and story games made its way into role-playing games. Like, comparing this to original D&D, and especially the comments made about D&D, it is basically the same conversation we're having today about D&D being overpriced and overly complicated for what it offers and what you get out of it. Like, Tunnels and Trolls is a storytelling game. That story is not a grand narrative, rather just about characters going down into dungeons, fighting stuff, and looking for treasure, but the game was still built in service of providing that narrative with minimal hassle. Whereas Dungeons & Dragons was rules for fantastic medieval wargames, campaigns playable with paper and pencil and miniature figures. It is very much at its core still a wargame built upon the rules of another wargame, with which you could have a narrative experience if you tried hard enough, but it wasn't designed for that. Basically, in Tunnels and Trolls, the mechanics serve the game, versus D&D, where the game serves the mechanics. And going back to my original bold clickbaity statement about Tunnels and Trolls being more deserving of the title of first modern role-playing game, if you compare this and original D&D to the wider role-playing hobby, Tunnels and Trolls definitely fits more with the general description of a role-playing game than original D&D does. It was a game that very intentionally separated itself from those wargaming roots and became a different kind of game that provided a different, more story and imagination-based experience. A distinction that was even acknowledged in the 4th edition rules. Which is also why it achieved the popularity it did as a solo game. The mechanics here are so simple that if a book says you encounter 2 swamp bats with a monster rating of 10 each, you have all the rules that tell you how to run that encounter by yourself. And just for a hypothetical here, if the following editions of D&D hadn't come out, if, say, I don't know, Boot Hill had somehow become TSR's big cash cow and dominated the entire industry for the next 50 years, would we really be classifying Dungeons & Dragons as a role-playing game? Or would we see it as a war game, albeit one that included some early elements that would later be refined and expanded in role-playing games? Essentially, are we sorting original Dungeons & Dragons into a category it doesn't belong in simply because it shares branding with later titles that do? And yes, we are. Now, mind you, I'm not saying that Tunnels & Trolls is perfect, just better than original Dungeons & Dragons. The rules are minimal to a fault and have some very perplexing choices, but at least they are actually explained. Also, it is from 1975, so you do have the problematic elements. Mostly just some jokes that I can't imagine ever landed well, but also things like the slavery rules, including such gems as female slaves costing 10 gold more for their beauty, and the spell to permanently enslave subdued monsters having a name that was definitely offensive even in 1975. And that's about it for Tunnels & Trolls. The first modern role-playing game, maybe. I mean, I kinda see it that way. And of course, there are still a number of other editions, so if y'all like this one, maybe I'll look at those too. In the future. And thank you for watching. If you enjoy the wacky things I say and do, you can follow me on Blue Sky and/or Tumblr. You can also join me live on Twitch, where sometimes things get a little weird. And extra special thanks to my Fightin' Flail Snails, Broken Unicorn, D-Stex, Hasterfan, Mix Woofers, Nikolai Snowtail, Randy Mulholland, Renee D, Stephen Kramer, Tila Glar, Toshirokuro, and Tyro the Fox. If you want to be cool like them, check out my Patreon or YouTube channel memberships, 2 different things that provide similar but distinct benefits. But if you don't want to do that, that's cool too. You can still hit all the lovely buttons, like, subscribe, these other videos that have mysteriously manifested from the ethers, which I am sure are lovely videos that you will also enjoy. And I will see you next time.